The grandfather clock in the foyer of the Reed estate struck 6, its resonant chimes echoing through empty hallways. Ethan Reed stood motionless in his kitchen, a space designed more for appearance than function. His fingers reached out to straighten a slightly crooked drawing, a child's artwork depicting 3 stick figures beneath a yellow sun. The largest figure wore a tie, the smallest had a wide smile, and between them stood a figure with long yellow hair, a person who didn't exist in their household. Ethan's phone vibrated with calendary reminders and emails marked urgent. The board meeting was in 3 hours. At 38, Ethan Reed carried himself with the practiced confidence of someone who had rebuilt himself around absence. Only his eyes, deep blue and perpetually vigilant, hinted at the exhaustion beneath his composed facade. The sound of small footsteps broke the stillness. Oliver Reed appeared in the doorway, school uniform already on but tie askew. At 7 years old, he carried an unusual quietness, as if he'd learned early that some spaces were meant to be filled with silence rather than sound. "I made a new one last night. Can we put it up?" Ethan took the folded paper his son offered, carefully opening it to reveal another family portrait, similar to the one already displayed, but with subtle differences. In this version, the yellow-haired figure was holding hands with both the tall figure and the small one. "It's very good. We'll put it up when you get home from school." Oliver nodded, his expression serious beyond his years. The grandfather clock chimed the quarter hour. "Mrs. Winters will take you to school today. I have an early meeting." Oliver's small shoulders dropped slightly, but he nodded again, already understanding that disappointment was easier when expected. Ethan placed a hand briefly on his son's head, a gesture that fell somewhere between affection and acknowledgement. The sleek black Audi pulled away from the driveway just as the sun began to rise over the Connecticut estate. Through the rearview mirror, Ethan caught a glimpse of Oliver standing at the window, backpack still clutched in his hands, watching his father drive away, a tableau frozen in time, repeating endlessly since Catherine's death 3 years ago. The headquarters of Family First Brands occupied the top 10 floors of a glass skyscraper in downtown Hartford. Ethan's grandfather had started the company 50 years ago with a single household product and the promise that family values were at the heart of everything they created. Now the corporation produced everything from baby food to household cleaners, all marketed with the wholesome image that had become their trademark. His assistant Margaret was already at her desk when he arrived, a stack of files organized by priority awaiting his attention. "The board expects the quarterly projections this morning, and Mr. Thompson called again about introducing you to his niece." Ethan took the files without breaking stride. "Tell him I'm focused on the Keller acquisition. My personal life isn't up for discussion." Margaret's expression remained neutral, but Ethan caught the slight tightening around her eyes. The board's increasing interest in his marital status wasn't a new concern, but it was becoming more difficult to dismiss. The company bylaws, written by his traditionalist grandfather, specified that leadership should embody the family values the brand represented. The morning passed in a blur of meetings and meetings. It wasn't until early afternoon that he returned to his office to find Margaret holding a message slip. "Principal Davis from Westbrook Academy called. Oliver had an incident at school. Nothing serious, but they're requesting you come in for a meeting tomorrow." Ethan took the message, a familiar weight settling in his chest. Another meeting, another discussion about Oliver's withdrawal, his reluctance to engage with other children, his preference for drawing alone during recess. "I'll call them back." The words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Margaret nodded and turned to leave, pausing at the door. "If I may say something, Mr. Reed, sometimes the most important business decisions aren't made in the boardroom." Her uncharacteristic directness left Ethan momentarily silent. The Reed estate appeared even larger in the fading light of early evening. As Ethan entered through the side door, voices from the kitchen caught his attention, not Mrs. Winters' familiar tones, but someone younger, animated with Oliver's softer responses interspersed. Ethan paused in the hallway, listening to the unfamiliar sound of his son's laughter. "So the brave knight raised his sword and said to the dragon," the woman's voice changed, becoming deeper, more theatrical, "I don't want to fight you. I just want to know why you're so angry all the time." Oliver's giggle followed, unexpectedly light. "That's not what knights say to dragons." Well, this one did. He was a very modern knight who believed in talking about feelings. Ethan stepped into the kitchen doorway to find Oliver seated at the counter, homework spread before him, eyes bright with amusement. Across from him stood a young woman Ethan didn't recognize. She was in her early 30s with blonde hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing jeans and a light blue sweater. Her hands were gesturing expressively as she continued the improvised story. Dad, the woman turned startled, her storytelling posture immediately shifting to something more reserved. Her eyes, a clear gray, widened slightly before she composed her expression. Mr. Reed, I'm Samantha Parker from the agency. Mrs. Winters had an appointment today, so they sent me instead. She extended a hand that Ethan didn't immediately take his attention, caught by the transformation in his son, who had slid off the stool and was now gathering his papers. Miss Parker was helping me with my homework and telling me a story about knights and dragons. Ethan finally shook the offered hand, noting the firmness of her grip despite her obvious discomfort under wide scrutiny. I wasn't expecting a replacement today. Mrs. Winters called this morning. I apologize if the agency didn't inform you. I've prepared dinner and Oliver has finished most of his homework. Her tone was professional, but not deferential, as if she were reporting to a colleague rather than an employer. Ethan found himself studying her more carefully, the slight calluses on her fingertips, the way she subtly shifted to include Oliver in the conversation rather than talking over him. Oliver, go wash up for dinner. His son hesitated, glancing at Samantha before nodding and gathering his remaining papers. As he passed Ethan, he paused. Can Miss Parker come back tomorrow? She doesn't make the mac and cheese all dry like Mrs. Winterson. Ethan looked from his son to the woman whose expression remained neutral, despite the small twitch at the corner of her mouth that suggested suppressed amusement. We'll see. Go wash up. Once Oliver had left the kitchen, Ethan turned his full attention to Samantha Parker, who had begun efficiently clearing the counter of homework materials. The agency sent your credentials. She glanced up, a flicker of something defensiveness, perhaps crossing her features before she nodded. Yes, though I imagine they're not what you're used to. I was an elementary school teacher before budget cuts. The agency takes temporary workers, and I needed something flexible while my brother is in treatment. She offered no further explanation, and Ethan didn't ask for one. Instead, he found himself watching as she moved around his kitchen with unexpected confidence. You're good with children. It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway, her focus on the task at hand rather than on him. I taught second grade for 6 years. Art and literature. Children make more sense to me than most adults. She placed a casserole dish on the table, the aroma of properly seasoned food filling the kitchen. Oliver reappeared, his hands still damp from washing his earlier animation, slightly subdued in Ethan's presence, but not entirely gone. The meal proceeded with an unusual dynamic. Oliver, typically silent during dinner, responded to Samantha's occasional questions about his school day and art projects. Ethan found himself observing rather than participating, struck by the ease with which this stranger had connected with his withdrawn son in the span of a single afternoon. As the meal concluded, Samantha began clearing the dishes. I should go soon, unless you need me to stay while you review Mrs. Toon. Winter's replacement options with the agency. Her directness caught Ethan off guard. Before he could respond, Oliver looked up from his plate. Can Miss Parker read me a story before bed? The request hung in the air, simple yet weighted with implications. Ethan studied his son's expression, hopeful but prepared for disappointment. Then he glanced at Samantha, whose composure had softened slightly at Oliver's question. I can stay a bit longer, if that's all right. Ethan nodded, a decision made more by the light in his son's eyes than by logical consideration. After Oliver was settled in bed, story read, and lights dimmed, Ethan found Samantha in the kitchen, finishing the last of the cleanup. She looked up as he entered, wiping her hands on a dish towel with a quiet efficiency. He's asleep, Ethan nodded, leaning against the doorframe, suddenly aware of the unusual position he found himself in, standing in his own kitchen, uncertain of the protocol, with a temporary housekeeper who had somehow managed to draw more words from his son in one afternoon than he sometimes heard in a week. The agency said Mrs. Winters needs surgery. She'll be out for at least 6 weeks. Samantha folded the towel, precisely hanging it on the rack beside the sink. That's what I understood as well. They'll send someone permanent soon, I'm sure. I'm just filling in. Ethan made a decision, one driven by the memory of Oliver's laughter echoing in the kitchen after so many months of silence. I'd prefer consistency for Oliver. The agency can send you for the duration if your schedule allows. She seemed surprised, though she masked it quickly. My schedule is flexible. I'll let them know. She gathered her bag, a worn leather satchel that had seen better days, and moved toward the door. Ethan followed, noticing for the first time that she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had known better circumstances, but refused to be diminished by their loss. 7:30 tomorrow, Ethan nodded, watching as she walked to an older model sedan parked at the edge of the circular drive. The following week established a new rhythm in the Reed household. Samantha arrived each morning as Ethan was preparing to leave for the office. She organized Oliver's lunch, checked his homework, and saw him off to school with the driver. When the boy returned in the afternoon, she helped with assignments, prepared dinner, and often read to him before Ethan returned from work. On the occasions when Ethan arrived home early enough to hear the stories, he found himself pausing in the hallway, listening to the animated voices and Oliver's delighted responses. It was during one of these moments, 10 days after Samantha had first appeared in their kitchen, that Ethan overheard a conversation that wasn't meant for him. "Miss Parker, why doesn't Dad ever tell me stories about Mom?" The question asked in Oliver's solemn voice froze Ethan in place. He knew he should make his presence known, step into the room, take control of the narrative that belonged to him, to them. But something kept him rooted to the spot, waiting for Samantha's response. "I think sometimes when people are very sad, they keep their stories inside because it hurts too much to let them out." "But doesn't that make them sadder?" There was a pause, and Ethan could imagine Samantha choosing her words carefully. "Yes, I think it probably does. But people have to decide for themselves when they're ready to share their stories. It's not something anyone else can decide for them." Oliver's voice dropped to nearly a whisper. "I'm afraid I'll forget her. I was only 4 when she died." Ethan's chest tightened, the pain, as fresh as the day Catherine had slipped away in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and endings. Her hand cold in his as monitors flatlined, and doctors spoke words that couldn't penetrate the roaring in his ears. "You won't forget her. She's part of you, in your smile, in the way you see the world, in the stories your dad will tell you when he's ready. And you know what else? What? You can keep her alive by making your own stories. All those drawings you do, they're your way of telling stories about the family you remember and the family you wish for." Ethan backed away silently, retreating to his study, where he remained until he heard the front door close, signaling Samantha's departure for the evening. Only then did he climb the stairs to Oliver's room, where he found his son already asleep, a drawing of 3 figures clutched in his small hand. The following morning, Ethan made a point of being in the kitchen when Samantha arrived. She entered with her usual quiet efficiency, setting down her bag, and immediately moving to begin breakfast preparations. Oliver still asleep. Ethan nodded, watching as she moved around the kitchen. "I need to speak with you about something." She paused, turning to face him fully, her expression composed but alert. Ethan was struck again by the directness of her gaze, the absence of the deferential manner he was accustomed to from household staff. "I'm listening. I overheard your conversation with Oliver last night about his mother." A flicker of concern crossed her features, quickly replaced by a calm steadiness. "I apologize if I overstepped," he asked, and I didn't feel it was right to dismiss his question. Ethan studied her for a moment, trying to identify the strange mixture of irritation and gratitude he felt. "You didn't overstep. You gave him an answer I should have provided long ago." She seemed surprised by his response, perhaps expecting reproach rather than acknowledgement. Before she could reply, Oliver appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from his eyes, his expression brightening at the sight of both adults in the kitchen, an unusual occurrence that immediately registered as significant in his observant mind. "Dad, you're still home." Ethan checked his watch, a habitual gesture that hadn't gone unnoticed by Samantha, whose slight smile suggested she found his time consciousness either amusing or telling. "I have a later meeting today. Thought we could have breakfast together." Oliver climbed onto a stool at the counter, his eyes moving between his father and Samantha, with undisguised curiosity. Samantha resumed her breakfast preparations, somehow expanding them seamlessly to include Ethan without asking if he would stay. The assumption should have irritated him. He was a man who guarded his schedule jealously, but instead he found himself accepting a cup of coffee and sitting beside his son, as if this were a regular occurrence rather than an anomaly in their carefully structured lives. The morning unfolded with an unexpected warmth, Oliver chattering more freely with both adults present, Samantha orchestrating the meal with casual confidence. It wasn't until Oliver had gone upstairs to finish dressing for school that Ethan found himself alone with Samantha again. "He talks to you." She looked up from wiping the counter, her expression thoughtful. Children often find it easier to talk to someone who isn't family. There's less at stake. Less fear of disappointment, she didn't say, but Ethan heard it nonetheless. He leaned against the counter, coffee cup still in hand, studying her with newfound curiosity. You said your brother is in treatment. The question clearly surprised her, though she recovered quickly, her hands continuing their methodical work. Yes, congenital heart condition. He's waiting for a specialized procedure, but there are complications with insurance. She offered no more details and Ethan didn't press, though he made a mental note to have Margaret look into the best cardiac specialists in the region. The board meeting that afternoon was particularly contentious. Walter Thompson, the most senior member and Ethan's most vocal critic, had brought up the leadership stability issue again, his euphemism for Ethan's continued single status. The company was founded on family values, Ethan. Your grandfather was explicit about the type of leadership image we project to our customers. Ethan maintained his composure, though the repeated references to his grandfather's vision had begun to wear thin. I'm well aware of the company's founding principles, Walter. My focus has been on expanding our market share while maintaining those values in our products and corporate culture. Thompson's smile didn't reach his eyes. And yet our CEO remains a bachelor after an appropriate mourning period. It projects instability, particularly with the Keller acquisition looming. They're a family-owned business with traditional values. Your situation has been noticed. The implication hung in the air, heavy with unspoken judgment. Ethan glanced around the table, noting the varying degrees of discomfort and agreement on the faces of the other board members. I've declined the introductions you've suggested because I'm focused on the business, not on manufacturing a personal life for public consumption. Thompson's expression hardened slightly. No one is suggesting you manufacture anything, Ethan, but there are suitable women who understand the demands of your position and the importance of maintaining appearances. My niece, for instance. Ethan cut him off with a raised hand, his patience wearing thin. I appreciate your concern, Walter, but my personal life remains my own. Now, if we could return to the quarterly projections, the meeting concluded with an undercurrent of tension that followed Ethan back to his office. Margaret's expression as she handed him his messages suggested she had already heard about the confrontation. News traveled quickly in the executive suite, particularly when it involved the CEO's private life. Mr. Thompson left this for you. She handed him a folder containing profiles of several women, complete with photographs and brief biographies highlighting their social connections and family backgrounds. Ethan set it aside without opening it, his irritation mounting. Anything else? Margaret hesitated, then nodded. Oliver's school called again. They're still waiting to schedule that meeting. Ethan rubbed his temples, feeling the beginnings of a headache. The school's concerns about Oliver's social withdrawal had escalated recently, with his teacher noting that he spent most of his free time drawing pictures of a family that didn't match his reality. I'll call them tomorrow. Margaret nodded, though her expression suggested she doubted this promise more than the ones that had preceded it. As she turned to leave, Ethan made a decision driven more by impulse than careful consideration. Wait, find out everything you can about cardiac specialists for congenital conditions, particularly those who take complex cases with insurance complications. Margaret's surprise was evident, but she asked no questions. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. It took him a moment to register that it was from Samantha. Oliver forgot his medicine. I've brought it to school, but thought you should know. Nurse says it's happened before. The message was direct and informative, without the apologetic tone he might have expected from staff. He found himself responding immediately. Thank you. I'll speak with him about being more responsible. Her reply came seconds later. He's 7 and dealing with a lot. Maybe a reminder system would help, rather than a lecture. Ethan stared at the message, caught between irritation at her presumption and a grudging recognition that she was probably right. Before he could formulate a response, another message appeared. Sorry if that was overstepping. Just a suggestion from someone who's worked with kids his age. He set the phone down without replying, his thoughts returning to Thompson's warnings about the upcoming acquisition and the company's image. The Keller negotiations were at a critical stage, with a family-owned competitor finally willing to discuss a merger after years of resistance. Any perception of instability in Ethan's leadership could jeopardize the deal. By the time Ethan returned home that evening, Oliver was already asleep and Samantha was preparing to leave. She looked up as he entered the kitchen, her expression carefully neutral, suggesting she was unsure of her standing after her text message earlier in the day. Oliver wanted to wait up, but it was getting late. Ethan nodded, setting his briefcase on the counter and loosening his tie, small gestures of fatigue he rarely displayed in front of others. Was he upset about the medicine? Samantha shook her head, gathering her belongings with unhurried movements. No. He made a calendar for his room with check boxes for morning and evening medication. His idea, not mine. The simple statement carried an undercurrent of gentle rebuke that Ethan chose to ignore. Instead, he found himself studying her with renewed curiosity. In the 2 weeks she had been in their home, subtle changes had occurred. Fresh flowers on the kitchen table. Oliver's artwork displayed more prominently the almost imperceptible shift in the household atmosphere, from sterile to something approaching lived-in. You've made changes. She paused, her bag half slung over her shoulder, uncertainty flickering across her features. Small ones. I can put everything back if you prefer. Ethan shook his head, moving to the refrigerator, where a new drawing had appeared, this one showing Oliver with a woman who was clearly meant to be Samantha, both of them painting at an easel. He's drawing more. Samantha approached, keeping a respectful distance, but close enough to see the artwork he was examining. It helps him process. Art is a language for things children don't have words for yet. She spoke with the quiet authority of someone who understood this from professional training rather than intuition alone. Ethan turned to face her, suddenly curious about the circumstances that had brought a qualified teacher to work as a temporary housekeeper. Your brother's condition, is it improving? The question clearly surprised her, though she maintained her composure. Stable for now. The specialists say he needs a procedure that's only performed at a few centers in the country. Our insurance considers it experimental. Her tone was matter-of-fact, but Ethan detected the underlying strain of someone carrying a burden they were determined not to show. What's the call? She looked at him sharply, her guard visibly rising. Why do you ask? Ethan realized too late how his question might sound intrusive or worse, condescending. He shifted his approach, moving back to safer territory. Oliver's school wants to meet about his social adjustment. You seem to understand him. I'd appreciate your insight before I speak with them. The diversion worked. Samantha's expression softened slightly, her focus returning to Oliver rather than her own circumstances. He's lonely. He doesn't know how to connect with other children because he's afraid of more loss. The drawings are his way of creating the connections he wants, but doesn't know how to build in real life. Her assessment was delivered without the psychological jargon the school counselor had used, yet it carried more weight precisely because of its simplicity. Ethan found himself nodding, a plan forming in his mind. Would you be willing to attend the meeting with me? Oh, as someone who observes him daily and has relevant professional background, Samantha seemed startled by the request, clearly not expecting to be included in such a decision. She considered for a moment before responding. If you think it would help Oliver, yes, but I'm just temporary household help, Mr. Reed. The school might find it unusual. Ethan dismissed her concern with a slight gesture. Your background in education is relevant. The school doesn't need to know the specifics of your employment. She studied him for a moment, her expression suggesting she was reassessing her understanding of him. Finally, she nodded. All right, for Oliver. The meeting was scheduled for the following afternoon. Ethan made arrangements to leave the office early, a rarity that raised eyebrows among his executive team, but went unquestioned. He arrived at the school to find Samantha already waiting in the parking lot, her appearance slightly more formal than her usual attire, a simple dress and cardigan that suggested professional without pretension. They walked into the building together, an unusual pairing that drew curious glances from staff who were accustomed to seeing Ethan alone on the rare occasions he appeared for school functions. Principal Davis greeted them in her office, where Oliver's teacher and the school counselor were already waiting. Introductions were made, with Ethan describing Samantha simply as part of our household staff who has a background in education and spends considerable time with Oliver. The meeting proceeded with the expected concerns: Oliver's reluctance to engage with peers, his preference for solitary activities, his drawings of a family that didn't match reality. The counselor expressed particular concern about Oliver's emotional development, citing research on childhood grief and attachment issues. It was Samantha who shifted the conversation, her voice quiet but clear. Have you asked Oliver why he prefers to draw alone? The teacher seemed taken aback by the question. Well, he doesn't really answer when we ask him directly. Samantha nodded thoughtfully. He draws to process emotions he doesn't have words for yet. The family in his pictures isn't fantasy, it's healing. He's not withdrawn because he's troubled. He's creating a safe space to work through his grief. The counselor leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. That's an interesting perspective, Miss Parker. Do you have experience with art therapy? Samantha hesitated, glancing briefly at Ethan before responding. I taught elementary art and literature for 6 years. I've seen how children use creative expression to navigate difficult emotions. Her response was honest, without revealing the temporary nature of her role in Oliver's life. The conversation shifted, with Samantha suggesting specific approaches to engage Oliver with other children through structured, creative activities, rather than forcing him into uncomfortable social situations. By the meeting's end, a plan of men had been developed that felt more aligned with Oliver's needs than the generic interventions previously proposed. As they walked back to their respective cars, Ethan found himself viewing Samantha in a new light. She had advocated for Oliver with a quiet conviction that demonstrated both professional insight and personal investment. Thank you for coming. That was helpful. Samantha nodded, her keys already in hand, clearly not expecting the conversation to extend beyond professional courtesy. I should get back. I left dinner preparations with instructions, but I'd like to hire you full-time. The words surprised them both. Samantha stared at him, clearly trying to determine if she had misheard. Full-time as Oliver's caregiver and household manager. Your background and education would be valuable for his development, and you've already established a rapport with them. Her expression shifted from surprise to wariness, her keys jingling slightly as her hand tightened around them. Mr. Reed, I'm a certified teacher. I'm working for the agency temporarily while my brother is in treatment. Once he's better, I plan to return to education. Ethan had anticipated resistance, but not this specific objection. He adjusted his approach, drawing on the negotiation skills that had served him well in the corporate world. I understand. Consider it a temporary arrangement with a more defined role and appropriate compensation. Say 6 months, it would provide stability for Oliver during a critical period and give you financial security while your brother recovers. Samantha's expression remained guarded, though he could see her considering the practical aspects of his offer. What exactly would this role entail? Household management, Oliver's care, educational support. You'd have the authority to make necessary decisions in my absence, within parameters we'd establish. And the compensation, Ethan named a figure significantly higher than standard rates for such positions. Samantha's eyes widened slightly, the only indication that the amount had registered as extraordinary. That's generous. It reflects the specialized nature of the position. She studied him for a moment, her gray eyes assessing in a way that made him uncharacteristically self-conscious. May I have some time to consider, of course, letting me know by Friday. Friday arrived without a definitive answer from Samantha. She continued her duties as usual, her interactions with Ethan polite but reserved. It wasn't until evening, after Oliver had gone to bed, that she approached him in his study. He looked up from his laptop to find her standing in the doorway, her expression suggesting she had reached a decision, but was not entirely comfortable with it. May I speak with you? Ethan closed the laptop, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Samantha entered but remained standing, her posture reflecting the formality she maintained in their interactions. I've considered your offer and I have conditions. Ethan raised an eyebrow, both surprised and intrigued by her directness. Most people approached negotiations with him, tentatively aware of the power imbalance inherent in his position. I'm listening. Samantha took a breath as if steeling herself. I need flexibility for my brother's appointments and eventual surgery. I need to be clear that this is a professional arrangement with a defined end date. I won't mislead Oliver about my role in your household. And I need the first month's salary in advance to secure my brother's place on the surgical waiting list. Her requests were reasonable, even modest, given the circumstances. Ethan found himself nodding, impressed by her clarity and focus on practical concerns rather than status or perks. Those terms are acceptable. I'll have the employment agreement drawn up on Monday with your advance ready by Tuesday. Relief flickered across her features, quickly replaced by composed professionalism. Thank you. I'll continue to do my best for Oliver. She turned to leave, then paused, looking back at him with an expression he couldn't quite interpret. Mr. Reed, may I ask why you're doing this? You could hire a professional nanny with specialized training in childhood grief? The question caught him off guard. He considered deflecting with a practical explanation about convenience or Oliver's established comfort with her, but something about her direct gaze prompted an unusual moment of honesty. Oliver laughs when you're here. He talks. He draws pictures that have color in them. That's something no credentials can guarantee. Samantha seems startled by his candor, a hint of genuine emotion breaking through her professional demeanor. She nodded once, the gesture carrying more acknowledgement than words could have conveyed, before leaving him alone with the lingering sense that something significant had shifted in the carefully controlled environment of the Reed household. The following weeks established a new rhythm. Samantha transitions from temporary help to a more integrated presence, her role expanding beyond basic household management to include educational activities for Oliver and more comprehensive oversight of the estate's operations. She converted a rarely used sitting room into a creative space where Oliver could explore art materials beyond his usual pencils and paper. Gradually, splashes of color began appearing in his drawings, and occasionally other children from his class joined him after school for structured art projects supervised by Samantha. Ethan observed these changes with a mixture of approval and caution. He appreciated the positive effects on Oliver, whose teacher had reported improved social interaction and academic engagement. Yet he found himself maintaining a careful distance from the warming atmosphere of his own home, as if acknowledging it might somehow disrupt the delicate balance he had established in the years since Catherine's death. It was Margaret who finally commented on the change, her decades of service granting her a candor few others would dare. "You're leaving the office before 7 more often these days." Ethan glanced up from reviewing contracts, momentarily disoriented by the observation. "The acquisition negotiations require me to be well rested." Margaret's expression suggested she didn't believe this explanation, but was too professional to say so directly. "Of course. And how is Oliver adjusting to Miss Parker's more permanent role?" The question carried layers of meaning that Ethan chose to address only at surface level. "Well, she has relevant experience and a structured approach that seems to be effective." Margaret nodded, a hint of something like satisfaction in her eyes. "I've completed the research on cardiac specialists you requested. The file is on your desk." Ethan had almost forgotten his request made weeks earlier when Samantha had first mentioned her brother's condition. He nodded his thanks, turning his attention to the folder Margaret had indicated. Inside was a comprehensive overview of the top cardiac specialists in the country, with particular focus on those who handled complex congenital cases. Attached was a separate sheet with a name highlighted: Dr. Andrew Winters at Boston Memorial, noted for pioneering a procedure specifically designed for cases like the one Samantha had described. As Margaret turned to leave, Ethan made a decision driven by impulse rather than his usual careful calculation. Schedule a call with Dr. Winters for tomorrow and find out the details of the waiting list for his surgical team. Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly, but she asked no questions, merely nodding before closing the door behind her. That evening, he arrived home earlier than usual to find Oliver and Samantha in the kitchen, engaged in what appeared to be a cooking lesson. Oliver stood on a stool at the counter, carefully measuring flour into a bowl, while Samantha supervised with patient guidance. Neither noticed Ethan's arrival immediately, their attention focused on the task at hand. "Now we add the baking powder, just a teaspoon." Oliver's face was a study in concentration as he measured the ingredient with exaggerated care, his tongue caught between his teeth in an expression so reminiscent of Catherine that Ethan felt a physical ache at the recognition. It was Samantha who finally noticed him standing in the doorway, her smile of greeting tinged with surprise at his early return. "Mr. Reed, we're making pancakes for dinner." Oliver's request, Oliver looked up, flour dusting his cheeks, his expression brightening. "Dad, Miss Parker says breakfast for dinner is a family tradition somewhere. Vermont. My grandmother's rule pancakes on rainy Wednesdays." Samantha's voice carried a warmth Ethan rarely heard when she addressed him directly, as if the shared activity with Oliver had temporarily lowered her usual professional guard. She wiped her hands on a dish towel, moving to set another place at the table without asking if he would be staying, an assumption that should have irritated him, but instead produced an unexpected sense of inclusion. "I have some calls to make, but I'll join you shortly." Oliver's face fell slightly, but he nodded with the practiced acceptance of a child accustomed to disappointment. It was Samantha's expression that caught Ethan off guard, not judgment exactly, but a quiet understanding that made him feel uncomfortably transparent. "We'll keep a plate warm." The simple statement carried more meaning than its literal interpretation, suggesting both an accommodation of his habits and a gentle invitation to reconsider them. Ethan retreated to his study, closing the door on the domestic scene, but unable to shut out the sound of Oliver's laughter floating down the hallway, a sound that had been absent from the house for so long that its return felt like both a gift and an accusation. The calls he needed to make were legitimate final points on the acquisition agreement that required his attention before the morning meeting. Yet he found himself working through them with unusual efficiency, his mind returning to the scene in the kitchen and the place waiting for him at the table. By the time he finished, he expected the meal to be over, Oliver already in bed with a story from Samantha. Instead, he found them still at the table, a plate covered with a napkin in his usual spot, their own meals only half finished, as if they had been deliberately pacing themselves. Oliver looked up expectantly as Ethan entered, his earlier disappointment replaced by cautious hope. We waited. Miss Parker said, "It's not really dinner unless everyone eats together." Ethan glanced at Samantha, whose expression remained neutral, though her eyes held a hint of challenge. She had deliberately established a new expectation, one that placed family connection above convenience or work demands. It was a small rebellion against the status quo of the Reed household, executed with such subtle skill that confronting it would make him appear petty or worse, indifferent to his son's happiness. She's right. He took his seat, removing the napkin to find pancakes, still warm butter, melting into the top layer. Oliver immediately launched into a detailed explanation of the recipe and his contribution to it, his animation a stark contrast to his usual quiet demeanor at mealtimes. Samantha occasionally guided the conversation with gentle prompts, creating space for Ethan to engage without forcing his participation. The meal progressed with an ease that felt foreign, yet vaguely familiar, echoing distant memories of family dinners before Catherine's illness had cast its shadow over their lives. By the time Oliver had cleared his plate and begun to yawn, Ethan realized he had eaten an entire meal without checking his phone once, a small shift that nonetheless represented a significant departure from his usual habits. "I can take him up for a story tonight if you'd like to finish your work." Samantha's offer was delivered casually, without pressure, leaving the choice entirely to him. Ethan found himself shaking his head, a decision made without the careful calculation he typically applied to even minor schedule adjustments. "I'll do it. You've done enough today." Oliver's expression brightened visibly, his fatigue momentarily forgotten as he slid from his chair and moved to Ethan's side. Samantha began clearing the table, her movements unhurried, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Not triumph exactly, but quiet satisfaction at a subtle shift in the household dynamics she had orchestrated with remarkable skill. As Ethan guided Oliver upstairs, his son's small hand in his, he found himself reflecting on the gradual changes that had occurred since Samantha's arrival. The house felt less like a museum dedicated to absence and more like a space where life was cautiously reasserting itself. Oliver was talking more, drawing pictures with vibrant colors, engaging with classmates for the first time in months. These were positive developments by any objective measure, yet Ethan found himself maintaining a careful emotional distance from them, as if acknowledging their value might somehow diminish the importance of what had been lost. The bedtime routine proceeded with Oliver chattering about his day, his friends, the art projects Samantha had helped him create for his classroom. As Ethan pulled the covers up, his son's expression grew suddenly serious, his small features composing themselves into a look of concentration. "Dad, is Miss Parker going to stay forever?" The question hung in the air, weighted with implications Ethan wasn't prepared to address. He kept his voice carefully neutral. "She's here to help us for now." "Why do you ask?" Oliver fidgeted with the edge of his blanket, his gaze fixed on his hands rather than his father's face. "Tommy at school said she's like a mom, but not really. He said she'll leave someday because that's what happens when people aren't really your family." The statement landed like a physical blow, revealing the depths of Oliver's insecurity and his struggle to categorize Samantha's role in their lives. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, searching for words that would provide comfort without creating false expectations. "Miss Parker has a job with us, but she also cares about you. That's real, even if it's different from family." Oliver nodded, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "But what if I want her to be family? Can she be family someday?" The question carried innocence but hit with precision, targeting the carefully maintained boundaries Ethan had established. He found himself momentarily speechless, caught between honesty and protection, between acknowledging his son's emotional needs and maintaining the controlled environment what he had created to shield them both from further loss. People become family in different ways, Oliver. But it's not something we can decide right now. What's important is that she's here today and she helps make our home better. The answer was diplomatic but unsatisfying even to his own ears. Oliver seemed to sense the evasion in his small shoulders slumping slightly beneath the covers. Ethan reached out, smoothing his son's hair, in a gesture that felt simultaneously natural and foreign. A movement his body remembered from before grief had made physical affection seem like an invitation to further pain. Time for sleep now. We can talk more tomorrow. Oliver nodded, his eyelids already heavy with fatigue. Ethan stood adjusting the nightlight and moving toward the door. As he reached for the light switch, Oliver's voice drifted from the bed, soft with approaching sleep. I hope she stays. She makes the house not feel empty anymore. The following morning, Ethan sat in his office reviewing the file Margaret had prepared on cardiac specialists. The information was comprehensive, detailing not only Dr. Winter's pioneering procedure, but also the usual cost insurance considerations and typical waiting periods for treatment. According to the research, patients with cases like Samantha's brother often waited 6 to 8 months for surgery unless they could secure private funding or participation in a research protocol. The following morning, he placed a call to Dr. Winter's office before heading to the company headquarters. The conversation was brief but productive, his family name and corporate position opening doors that might have remained closed to others. By the time he arrived at the office, he had secured a consultation appointment for Samantha's brother with the possibility of inclusion in a new research protocol that would cover the experimental aspects of the procedure. The day proceeded with the usual demands of the acquisition process, meetings flowing one into another with barely time for reflection. It wasn't until late afternoon that Margaret appeared in his doorway with an expression that immediately signaled something unusual. Mr. Reed, Walter Thompson is here to see you. He says it's urgent and personal. Ethan glanced at his calendar, noting no scheduled appointment with the board member. Thompson's unannounced visit suggested either a significant development in the acquisition negotiations or more likely another attempt to press his agenda regarding Ethan's personal life. Send him in. Thompson entered with the confident stride of someone accustomed to deference, his tailored suit and carefully maintained appearance, reflecting his position as one of Hartford's old money patriarchs. At 65, he carried himself with the authority of a man who had spent decades in boardrooms and exclusive clubs, his silver hair and patrician features lending gravity to even his most casual remarks. Ethan, thank you for seeing me without an appointment. I wouldn't have come unannounced if it weren't important. Ethan gestured to the chair across from his desk, maintaining a neutral expression despite his wariness. What can I do for you? Walter Thompson settled into the chair, his posture deliberately relaxed, though his eyes remained sharp and assessing. The Keller negotiation is at a critical stage. Richard Keller has expressed concerns about our leadership stability. Ethan kept his expression impassive, though internally he felt a flicker of irritation at the familiar refrain. The company's performance speaks for itself. Our market position is strong, our growth projections solid. Thompson nodded, a gesture that acknowledged the point without conceding it. Numbers aren't everything, Ethan. The Kellers are old-fashioned. 3 generations of family ownership. They care about who they're selling to, not just the price. Ethan leaned back slightly, studying the older man's expression. And they've expressed these concerns to you specifically. A calculated risk implying that Thompson might be overstepping, speaking to the Kellers outside official channels. Thompson's slight smile suggested he recognized the probe and was untroubled by it. Richard and I have known each other for 30 years. We play golf at the same club. He values my opinion on the character of family-first leadership. The implication hung in the air, clear though unstated. Thompson's support, or lack thereof, could influence the acquisition outcome. Ethan maintained his composed exterior, though his mind was already calculating potential responses and their likely consequences. I appreciate your long-standing relationship with the Kellers, Walter, but my personal life remains separate from company business. Thompson's expression hardened slightly, the pretense of casual concern falling away. Not in this business, Ethan, not with this company. Your grandfather understood that family values aren't just a marketing slogan, they're the foundation of what we sell. The board has been patient during your mourning period, but it's been 3 years. The company needs stability. You need stability. The reference to Catherine's death, however oblique, triggered a familiar tightening in Ethan's chest. He kept his voice deliberately even. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Walter Thompson reached into his suit jacket, withdrawing a small velvet box that he placed on the desk between them. Ethan stared at it, momentarily confused, until Thompson opened it to reveal an antique diamond ring, its setting clearly from another era. "My mother's ring. Perfect for an engagement that would signal stability to the board, to the Kellers, to everyone watching our company during this transition." Ethan's confusion deepened, his gaze moving from the ring to Thompson's face. "I don't understand." Thompson smiled, a practiced expression that didn't reach his eyes. "My niece Caroline would make an excellent partner for someone in your position. She understands the demands of corporate life, the importance of appearances. The board would be reassured that Keller's impressed, and you would have a suitable companion for business functions without the messiness of an emotional entanglement." The proposal was delivered with such matter-of-fact confidence that Ethan momentarily struggled to formulate a response, the sheer presumption rendering him temporarily speechless. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a coldness that few in his professional circle had ever heard. "I appreciate your concern for the company, Walter, but I will not arrange my personal life to satisfy the board's antiquated notions of propriety or to smooth an acquisition, however important." Thompson's expression hardened, his facade of benevolent advice dropping completely. "This isn't a suggestion, Ethan. It's a reality check. The board is prepared to call a vote on leadership if you continue to project instability. Your grandfather's bylaws are quite clear about the character requirements for the CEO position." Ethan stood, a deliberate signal that the meeting was concluded. "Thank you for your candor, Walter. I'll take your concerns under advisement." Thompson rose more slowly, leaving the ring box open on the desk, a visual reminder of the ultimatum he had delivered. "The vote is scheduled for next month, immediately before the Keller signing. I suggest you consider your options carefully." With that parting statement, he exited the office, leaving Ethan standing behind his desk, the open ring box between them like a gauntlet thrown in some outdated ritual of challenge. Margaret appeared in the doorway moments later, her expression suggesting she had at least some awareness of the confrontation's nature, though she made no comment beyond a simple inquiry about whether Ethan needed anything before her departure for the day. Left alone, Ethan closed the ring box with a decisive snap, placing it in his desk drawer rather than returning it immediately to Thompson, a small act of defiance that nonetheless felt significant. The conversation had crystallized something he had been sensing for months. The increasing pressure from the board wasn't simply about traditional values or company image. It was about control, Thompson's desire to maintain influence over the company's direction through manipulation of its leadership. As Ethan drove home that evening, his thoughts circled around Thompson's ultimatum and the broader implications for his position at Family First. The acquisition of Keller Industries represented not just a business opportunity, but a strategic move that would secure the company's market position for decades to come. If Thompson succeeded in undermining the deal, or worse, in forcing a leadership vote, the consequences would extend far beyond Ethan's personal circumstances to affect thousands of employees and the company's long-term stability. The house lights were on when he arrived, the kitchen windows glowing warmly against the deepening twilight. He sat in the car for a moment, observing the scene from a distance, this home that had felt like a mausoleum for so long, now showing signs of life again. The thought led inevitably to Oliver's innocent question about Samantha becoming family, and suddenly, like pieces shifting in a kaleidoscope, a solution began to form in Ethan's mind, pragmatic, strategic, and completely unexpected. He entered the house to find Oliver and Samantha in the kitchen, engaged in homework at the counter. They looked up as he appeared in the doorway, Oliver's face brightening while Samantha's expression showed her usual professional welcome tinged with curiosity at his earlier-than-usual arrival. "Dad, Miss Parker is helping me with my solar system project. I'm doing Neptune because it's blue and nobody else wanted it." Ethan set down his briefcase, his attention divided between his son's enthusiasm and the plan taking shape in his mind. "Sounds interesting. Why don't you finish up while I speak with Miss Parker for a moment?" Oliver nodded, returning to his project with renewed focus. Samantha rose from her seat, a question in her eyes as she followed Ethan into the adjoining study. He closed the door partially, ensuring privacy while still allowing them to monitor Oliver in the kitchen. "Is everything all right?" Her question was direct, her expression shifting to concern as she registered the unusual tension in his demeanor. Ethan considered his approach carefully, aware that what he was about to propose would either solve multiple problems simultaneously or create an entirely new set of complications. I need to discuss something with you, a business matter that may have personal implications. Samantha's expression remained attentive but wary, her posture suggesting she was prepared for some change in her employment status. I'm listening. Ethan maintained his professional demeanor, approaching the conversation as he would a complex negotiation. The company is pursuing an acquisition that's critical to our long-term strategy. The board, particularly Walter Thompson, has expressed concerns about my personal situation, specifically that as a single parent, I don't project the family stability our brand represents. He paused, noting Samantha's slight frown as she processed this information, clearly uncertain of its relevance to her position. I'm not sure how this concerns me, Mr. Reed. Ethan drew a breath, the directness of his next statement surprising even himself. I need you to pretend to be my girlfriend. 1 month, $50,000 up front. The dish in Samantha's hand slipped slightly under the stream of warm water. She turned slowly, droplets glistening on her fingers, her eyes wide with disbelief. I'm sorry, what did you just say? Ethan stood across the kitchen, his suit immaculate, his face unreadable. The evening light streamed through the windows, casting a golden glow behind him, but nothing about him felt warm. You heard me. It's a professional arrangement. 1 month you pretend to be my girlfriend. Samantha grabbed a towel, trying to steady herself. The proposal was so unexpected, so outside the boundaries of their carefully constructed employer-employee relationship, that she momentarily wondered if she had misunderstood. Mr. Reed, I'm your housekeeper. I make your son's lunch. I fold your socks. I'm not this. Ethan moved closer, lowering his voice, though Oliver remained focused on his homework in the next room. You're intelligent, discreet, and not prone to drama. Most importantly, Oliver trusts you. I don't bring just anyone around him. Samantha blinked at the mention of the boy. In the weeks she had been with the Reeds, she had grown attached to Oliver, his quiet intelligence, his artistic sensitivity, his careful observations of the world around him. And I don't have time to find someone else. The board meeting is in 2 weeks. The Keller acquisition signing is 3 days after. The timing is critical. Samantha set the towel down with deliberate care, buying herself a moment to process his request. The amount he had mentioned, $50,000, was exactly what Jamie needed for his procedure. There's a corporate event next week. The board will be there. Some of them are traditionalists. They don't trust a single man to lead a family-first brand. You're a widower, she replied, her voice softening slightly at the acknowledgement of his loss. They think that means I'm unstable, vulnerable. I've already declined 2 arranged introductions from shareholders. 1 more refusal and they'll start pushing for a vote. Samantha stood frozen, the implications of his request expanding in her mind. This wasn't just about attending a few events. It was about deceiving people who controlled Ethan's professional future. And you think bringing me in, parading me around will fix that I don't parade? He replied flatly, then added, You'll attend events with me, smile, make conversation, nothing more. I'll draft a contract. You'll be paid in full. $50,000. Enough for Jamie's heart surgery. Enough to stop the calls from hospitals. Enough to give him a chance. I don't belong in your world, Mr. Reed. Maybe that's exactly why they'll believe it. The refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked. Her head spun with possibilities and consequences with the weight of the decision before her. I need time to think, she whispered. Ethan nodded, once professional, even in this most unprofessional of discussions. I'll need your answer tomorrow. That night, Samantha sat at the tiny desk in her apartment, bills spread across the surface, a worn folder containing her brother's medical records in her lap. Jamie was 16, too young to understand the complexities of health insurance denials or the economics of experimental treatments. On her laptop screen, an email from the specialist's office displayed the latest estimate for the procedure Jamie needed, $47,500 plus recovery care. Her savings account showed $3,246 The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Samantha stepped into the kitchen of the Reed estate. Ethan sat at the counter with a cup of coffee, already dressed for the office, his expression revealing nothing of the unusual conversation they had shared the previous evening. I'll do it. He looked up, one brow raised slightly. The girlfriend thing, she clarified. Just for 1 month. I want everything in writing. Boundaries, payment, duration. Of course, he replied calmly, as if they were discussing a revision to the household grocery budget rather than a counterfeit romance. And one more thing. Yes, I'm not changing who I am. No red lipstick, no fake flirting, and I won't laugh at boring jokes. He let out something halfway between a sigh and a chuckle. Noted, she crossed her arms, needing to establish the reality beneath the illusion they were about to create. This is just a role, Mr. Reed. He met her gaze, something unreadable flickering behind his composed exterior. Of course, they shook hands, a businesslike conclusion to a most unbusinesslike arrangement. The contract arrived via courier that afternoon, its legal language transforming their unorthodox arrangement into something that at least appeared legitimate on paper. Samantha signed it, her signature steady despite the uncertainty churning inside her. The courier handed her an envelope containing a certified check for the full amount. Within hours, she had deposited the check and called the surgical center to secure Jamie's place on the calendar. The procedure was scheduled for 3 weeks away, perfectly timed with the conclusion of her arrangement with Ethan. The following day brought the first tangible evidence of their new arrangement. A stylist arrived at the Reed estate accompanied by racks of clothing in Samantha's size and an array of accessories that cost more than her monthly rent. Samantha stood awkwardly in front of the 3-panel mirror, shifting from one foot to the other as the tailor adjusted the hem of a dress that probably cost more than her car. Ethan sat nearby, arms crossed, silently observing the transformation of his housekeeper into something society would deem worthy of a CEO's attention. "Is this really necessary?" she asked over her shoulder, uncomfortable with both the expense and the scrutiny. Ethan nodded once. "The event is formal. You need to look the part." She turned back to the mirror. The dress hugged her frame, modestly flaring slightly at the waist. Her blonde hair had been twisted into a simple chignon by a stylist who had arrived an hour earlier. "Do I pass as a CEO's girlfriend now?" she asked with a dry smile. Ethan didn't return it, but his voice was quieter when he answered. "You always did. This is just polishing." The statement caught her off guard, its near compliment so unexpected that she momentarily forgot the artifice of their situation. Before she could respond, Oliver appeared in the doorway, his eyes widening at the sight of Samantha in the elegant dress. "You look like a princess," he declared with the unfiltered honesty of childhood. "Thank you, Oliver. It's just for a grown-up party." The boy's next question cut through the pretense with devastating precision. "Are you going with Dad?" "Like a date," Samantha froze, looking to Ethan for guidance. They hadn't discussed how to explain their arrangement to Oliver, whose emotional well-being was supposedly at the center of Ethan's concerns. Ethan cleared his throat, addressing his son with unusual directness. "Miss Parker is going to accompany me to some work events. It's a temporary arrangement." Oliver's face fell slightly, the distinction between temporary arrangement and date clearly registering in his sensitive mind. "But she'll still be here with us," after Oliver pressed, seeking reassurance. "Yes," Ethan confirmed, though his gaze flickered to Samantha with something like uncertainty. "Miss Parker's job here doesn't change." Later, as the styling team packed their equipment, Samantha sought out Ethan in his study. "We need to discuss Oliver." Ethan closed the computer, giving her his full attention. "What about him?" "He's already attached to me as his caregiver. This pretend relationship could confuse him, create expectations that will only lead to disappointment when it ends." Ethan considered her words, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk, a rare display of unsettled energy from a man who typically maintained rigid control. "Oliver understands more than you might think. He knows about arrangements, about people who come and go." The statement was delivered factually, but Samantha caught the undertone of something deeper. Perhaps Ethan's own experience with loss, with the impermanence of connections. "Children don't compartmentalize like adults, Mr. Reed. They see patterns, make connections, build hopes based on what they observe. When he sees us attending events together, dressed up, acting like a couple, it creates a narrative for him." Ethan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "What do you suggest?" Samantha had considered this question carefully during the fittings. "We tell him a version of the truth, that sometimes grown-ups attend events together as friends to help each other with work things. That it doesn't change our regular roles in the house. We don't pretend around him." Ethan studied her, perhaps reassessing her understanding of his son. "Agreed. No pretending with Oliver." The ballroom of the luxury hotel sparkled with chandeliers and quiet wealth. Samantha stood beside Ethan at the entrance, hand resting lightly on his arm, heart thundering against her ribs. Inside, violins played, champagne flowed, and conversation danced in polite tones. Executives and board members mingled beneath the glow of golden lights. The moment they entered, heads turned. Samantha felt them like spotlights, assessing, categorizing, determining her value and validity in their rarefied world. She took a breath and lifted her chin, remembering that this was a performance with a purpose, Jamie's heart. Oliver's stability, a contract with clear boundaries. "You're doing fine," Ethan murmured, without looking at her. They stepped further into the room, and Samantha reminded herself to smile, to breathe, to play her part in this elaborate charade. Ethan leaned slightly toward her, his voice low near her ear. "Be yourself, the calm, observant, kind version. That's the one they'll trust." Strangely, the words steadied her more than the heels she'd practiced in all week. Perhaps because they acknowledged that there was something authentic about her presence here, some core truth beneath the designer dress and borrowed jewelry. "Miss Parker, is it?" A well-dressed man approached with a firm handshake and evaluating eyes. "Ethan has been very discreet." "How did you two meet?" Lisa smiled politely, drawing on her years of parent-teacher conferences where diplomacy was essential, but honesty paramount. "At the house. I was working there." One of those unexpected turns life sometimes throws at you. Laughter rippled through the group that had gathered around them, though Samantha detected varying degrees of sincerity in the response. A woman in a silk gown tilted her head, diamond earrings catching the light as she moved. "So you weren't born into this world?" "Not even close," Samantha replied with a graceful chuckle that masked her internal bristling at the woman's tone. Though knowing how to clean a kitchen does come in handy before hosting a dinner party. Ethan choked slightly on his champagne, covering it with a cough. Samantha shot him a mischievous glance, momentarily forgetting the performative nature of their connection in the genuine amusement they shared at the socialite's expense. "And what do you do?" "Miss Parker," someone else asked the question, carrying the weight of status assessment that seemed to underpin all conversation in this circle. "I'm hoping to teach again, art and literature, but right now I'm focused on what matters most. Family, health, people." There was a beat of respectful silence, her simple priorities temporarily disrupting the usual flow of status signaling and career positioning. Then Ethan's voice, quieter than she had ever heard it before. "She's more qualified than most." Samantha turned her head, startled by both the compliment and the warmth with which it was delivered. Their eyes met. The room continued buzzing around them, but Ethan kept looking at her long after the conversation moved on, something shifting in his typically guarded expression. Later, needing air, Samantha stepped out onto the balcony. The city stretched far below lights and steel, cold and endless. The dress, the hair, the polite laughter, inside it all felt distant from the woman who used to read by flashlight to her little brother during power outages in their drafty apartment. "You did well in there." She turned to find Ethan standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the warm light from inside. He moved toward her, stopping at a respectful distance, one hand in his pocket, his face more relaxed than she had seen it since their arrangement began. "I just answered honestly." "Mostly." He almost smiled, a slight upward tilt at the corner of his mouth that vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Thompson was impressed. "That's not easy to accomplish." Samantha leaned against the railing, considering the board member who had been watching them closely all evening, his scrutiny more analytical than the merely curious gazes of the other guests. "He doesn't seem entirely convinced." Ethan joined her at the railing, looking out over the city rather than at her. "Thompson has known me since I was a child. He was my father's friend, my grandfather's advisor. He thinks he can read me." "Can he?" Ethan turned to face her, the city lights reflecting in his eyes. "He used to, before Catherine died." The mention of his late wife hung in the air between them, an intimacy neither had anticipated in their businesslike arrangement. Samantha remained silent, sensing that Ethan had surprised himself with the personal disclosure. The evening concluded without further personal revelations, Ethan and Samantha playing their roles with increasing confidence as the hours passed. The drive back to her apartment was quiet, both lost in their own reflections on the night's successes and tensions. The charity gala was held in an old museum-turned-event space downtown with glass ceilings, ivy-covered walls, and a string quartet playing softly in the atrium. Guests wore diamonds like casual accessories and donated five-figure checks between sips of champagne. Samantha stood beside Ethan in a floor-length navy dress, her blonde hair styled in soft waves. "You don't have to speak much tonight," Ethan said, handing her a wine glass. "Just stay beside me, smile when necessary, and please no red wine." She looked at the pale liquid, the instruction landing with unexpected weight. "So I don't trip, don't speak, and don't stain the dress." "Got it." Anything else? Ethan blinked, caught off guard by her tone. "I didn't mean it to sound controlling." "But it did," she said, quietly, eyes on the glass. Despite his consideration about the cause, Ethan still viewed her primarily as an accessory to be managed, her behavior directed to support his image rather than as a partner in their shared deception. Before he could respond, a man in a gray suit appeared, his voice filled with recognition that sent a jolt of panic through Samantha. "Well, well, if it isn't Samantha Parker." Samantha turned startled, then smiled warmly as relief replaced her initial alarm. "David," Ethan stiffened as she stepped forward to hug the man. The embrace lingered just a second too long for professional acquaintances. David Brooks looked like someone pulled from the pages of Samantha's old life, athletic, polished, confident in a way that required no corporate title or family legacy. "It's been years. What are you doing here? Don't tell me you're actually running in these circles now." Samantha laughed, that light, effortless sound Ethan had rarely heard from her, not really just tagging along as a plus one. David gave Ethan a passing glance, but his focus stayed on Samantha. So did hers. They talked easily about old professors, mutual friends, a closed-down bookstore they both loved. Samantha leaned in as she laughed. She touched David's arm once without thinking the gesture natural in a way her choreographed interactions with Ethan never were. "I'm teaching art again," she explained, though not in a traditional classroom. More of a private arrangement. David nodded clearly, pleased by the information. "Always knew you'd find your way back to it. You were the most talented person in our program." Ethan watched from a slight distance, something tight building in his chest, as he observed Samantha's animation, her unguarded enjoyment of the conversation. This wasn't the careful performance she presented with him, but something authentic, a glimpse of who she was when unburdened by pretense or contractual obligations. Eventually, David excused himself to greet other attendees, promising to reconnect before the evening's end. Samantha rejoined Ethan, her cheeks flushed from the energetic conversation, a genuine smile lingering on her lips. "Sorry about that. David and I were in the same teaching program." Ethan nodded once, his expression carefully neutral, despite the unfamiliar emotion churning beneath his composed exterior. "You seemed quite familiar." Samantha glanced at him, detecting something in his tone that gave her pause. "We dated briefly in college. Is that a problem?" "Not at all," Ethan replied, his voice controlled. "You're free to associate with whomever you choose." The formal phrasing struck Samantha as odd given the context, but she attributed it to Ethan's generally reserved nature. The evening continued with Samantha meeting various donors and board members involved with the Arts Education Initiative. Later, she found Ethan alone at the bar, swirling his second glass of scotch. His jaw was tense in a way she had come to recognize as suppressed emotion, usually irritation or frustration with business matters. She approached cautiously, uncertain of the source of his apparent displeasure. "Hey," she said gently. "I was looking for you. You seemed occupied," he replied, not turning to her. His tone carried an edge she hadn't heard directed at her before. "That was David, an old friend," she said, confused by his reaction. "We haven't seen each other in years." "Clearly," he muttered. "You two seemed eager to make up for lost time." She frowned, the implication registering with growing disbelief. "Are you upset?" Ethan finished his drink, setting the glass down with controlled precision. "Of course not. Why would I be? I thought this was supposed to be pretend." "It is," she confirmed, increasingly perplexed by his behavior. "Then maybe you should remember that." The words hit harder than he had intended, their dismissive tone cutting through the collegial rapport they had been building. Samantha stepped back, wounded more than angry. "I was just being polite," she said softly. "Then be polite with someone else's reputation," he said, turning away. "I'm going to speak with the event chair." He walked away, leaving Samantha standing alone at the bar, the calculated rejection burning in her chest. She remained where she was, processing the interaction with growing indignation. His response had been disproportionate to any perceived slight, suggesting an emotional investment in their arrangement that contradicted its supposedly professional nature. Throughout the remainder of the evening, Ethan maintained a cool distance, speaking to Samantha only when necessary for appearances. The drive home proceeded in strained silence, the earlier connection they had shared seemingly erased by whatever had triggered Ethan's withdrawal. When the car stopped at her apartment building, Samantha turned to him, determined to address the tension directly. "What happened tonight?" Ethan kept his gaze forward, his profile rigid in the dim light. "Nothing happened. It was a successful event." Samantha shook her head, refusing to accept the evasion. "You were upset about David, why our agreement doesn't include monitoring my past relationships." Ethan's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on his knee, the only visible sign of his internal state. "Your behavior reflected on our supposed relationship. It undermined the credibility we're trying to establish." Samantha studied him, trying to reconcile his explanation with the intensity of his reaction. "I was friendly with an old colleague. Nothing I did suggested I wasn't committed to our arrangement." The hesitation before the final word hung between them, highlighting the artificial nature of their connection, despite the genuine emotions it seemed to be generating. Ethan finally turned to her, his expression controlled, but his eyes revealing a complexity his words did not acknowledge. "I apologize if I overreacted. It's been a long day." The non-apology did little to resolve the tension, but Samantha recognized it as the closest thing to a concession she was likely to receive. She nodded once and reached for the door handle. "I'll see you tomorrow, Ethan." In the days that followed, Ethan grew cold and distant. He spoke only when necessary. Left the house early, returned late. Samantha kept to her duties, pretending not to notice the shift, while internally questioning whether their arrangement could continue effectively with such obvious strain between them. Oliver, sensitive to the household's emotional currents, picked up on the change immediately. "Daddy's grumpy," the little boy said one night as Samantha read him a story. "Did he break something?" She smiled, brushing his hair back from his forehead with gentle fingers. "Maybe just his brain." She laughed to soften the comment, but her chest ached with the truth beneath the joke. Something had broken, or at least cracked, in the careful structure of their arrangement. The pretense was becoming too real, generating authentic emotions neither of them had anticipated when signing their clinical contract. Late one night, unable to sleep, Samantha went to the kitchen for tea. Her mind kept circling the charity gala, trying to understand why she suddenly felt guilty for laughing with an old friend for experiencing genuine pleasure in the midst of her performance. As she opened the cabinet, her hands trembled slightly with fatigue and unresolved tension. Instead of tea, she sank into a chair and buried her face in her palms. "Samantha." She looked up, startled. Ethan stood in the doorway, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened, his expression different, softer, like he had not slept either. "I didn't know you were still awake," she said quickly, wiping her face, embarrassed to be caught in a moment of vulnerability. Ethan walked over and held out a folded handkerchief, real cotton, monogram still warm, from his pocket. She hesitated, then took it, the simple kindness almost undoing her composure again. "I wasn't fair to you," he said quietly. "At the gala." Samantha shook her head, unwilling to revisit the uncomfortable interaction. "You don't have to explain. I get it. I overstepped, and this whole thing is weird." He knelt slightly, meeting her eyes with unusual directness. "You didn't overstep." "I did." The admission hung between them, unexpected and unelaborated. Samantha searched his face, waiting for more explanation, for some clarification of what exactly he thought he had done wrong, or why it had affected him so strongly. But Ethan stood up, gave a faint nod, and turned to leave, apparently considering the matter closed with his minimal acknowledgement. "Ethan," she called softly, stopping him at the doorway. "Do you want me to continue with our arrangement?" He turned back, his expression once again composed, the momentary vulnerability concealed behind his usual mask of control. "Yes, the board meeting is next week. Your presence has already created the impression we needed. It would be counterproductive to change course now." "Then we continue," she confirmed, her voice steadier than she felt. "But we need to be clearer about boundaries, for both our sakes." "Agreed," Ethan replied, relief flickering briefly across his features at her willingness to proceed without demanding greater emotional accountability. "We'll discuss the details tomorrow." He left her alone in the kitchen, the handkerchief still clutched in her hand, damp with her tears, and something she was no longer sure she could hide, not from him, not from herself. The pretense was becoming real, at least for her, and that realization was more frightening than any social event or board meeting they might face together. Rain pattered softly against the tall windows of the Reed estate the following morning, a gentle rhythm that filled the quiet hallways. Samantha sat cross-legged on the living room rug, a giant sketch pad spread before her, colored pencils scattered around like confetti. Oliver sat across from her, his brow furrowed in concentration as he carefully drew a lopsided tree. "That's actually pretty good," Samantha said, nodding thoughtfully. "You gave it personality." Oliver grinned, pride illuminating his features. "It's a sad tree because it's raining or lonely," she said dramatically. "Should we give it a friend?" Oliver picked up a blue crayon. "Maybe a dog." From the doorway, Ethan stood silently, watching his hand rested lightly on the doorframe, his phone forgotten in his palm. He had come down to ask about a missing file, something trivial, but what he saw rooted him in place. Samantha's soft laughter, Oliver's quiet joy. The scene looked natural, like something out of a life he used to imagine before everything turned to ash. He left without saying a word, unwilling to interrupt the moment with his presence. In his study, he found himself staring at the family photo on his desk, Catherine holding a toddler, Oliver himself standing slightly apart, smiling but somehow already separate even before death had made the division permanent. The board meeting was scheduled for the following day, a final assessment before the Keller acquisition signing. That evening, Ethan made a point of joining Oliver and Samantha for dinner, arriving home earlier than usual, and participating in the conversation rather than merely observing. After Oliver went upstairs to prepare for bed, Ethan remained at the table, a departure from his usual habit of retreating immediately to his study. "The board meeting tomorrow, I'd like you to attend." Samantha looked up from clearing the dishes, surprise evident in her expression. "Is that necessary? I thought your relationship status was already established." Ethan nodded, his fingers tapping lightly on the table, that rare tell of inner tension she had come to recognize. "Thompson is pushing for a vote on leadership. Your presence would reinforce the stability narrative we've been creating." Samantha studied him, trying to determine if there was more to the request than professional strategy. "What would it involve?" "Mostly observation. The board will be evaluating my presentation on the acquisition. Your role would be supportive, not participatory." She considered the request, weighing it against the emotional complications that had developed between them. Attending a board meeting represented a deeper level of involvement in Ethan's professional life, a further blurring of the already indistinct boundaries of their arrangement. "All right," she finally agreed. "What time? 9:30? The car will pick you up at 8:45. The board meeting proceeded with the formal precision typical of corporate governance. Samantha sat slightly behind Ethan at the expansive table, dressed in a conservative navy suit. She observed the dynamics with a teacher's trained eye for group behavior, the alliances and tensions, the subtle power plays beneath polite professional discourse. Walter Thompson dominated the discussion, his questions about the Keller acquisition pointed and occasionally undermining. His gaze frequently shifted to Samantha, assessing her presence with calculating intensity, as if searching for evidence that might confirm his suspicions about the sudden appearance of a relationship in Ethan's carefully controlled life. When the acquisition details had been thoroughly reviewed and the vote scheduled for the following week, Thompson introduced a seemingly casual topic that carried unmistakable subtext. "Before we adjourn, I'd like to extend an invitation to both of you, Ethan. My niece Caroline is hosting a dinner at her home this weekend. Several board members will be attending. We'd welcome the opportunity to get to know Ms. Parker better in a more informal setting." The invitation was clearly a test, an opportunity for Thompson to evaluate Samantha more thoroughly, perhaps to probe for inconsistencies in their narrative. Ethan glanced briefly at Samantha before responding with practiced ease. "Thank you, Walter. We'll check our schedule and let you know." As the meeting concluded and board members dispersed, Thompson approached Samantha directly, his manner courteous, but his eyes sharp with assessment. "Ms. Parker, I understand you were previously a teacher. What a fascinating career change." Samantha met his gaze with calm directness, aware of the probing nature of his seemingly innocent question. "Not a change so much as an evolution. Education takes many forms, Mr. Thompson." "Indeed it does," he replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I look forward to learning more about your evolution at Caroline's dinner. I do hope you can both attend." When she and Ethan were alone in the elevator, she addressed the subtext directly. "He doesn't believe we're really together." Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful rather than concerned. "Thompson is naturally suspicious. It's what makes him effective on the board." Samantha turned to face him, the confined space of the elevator, emphasizing the personal nature of their conversation despite its professional context. "His niece, is she the one he wanted you to date?" Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, confirming her suspicion before he verbally acknowledged it. "Yes, Caroline is 35 from an appropriate family, suitably educated. Thompson has been pushing the match for months. And now he wants to compare us, Samantha concluded, understanding the strategic nature of the dinner invitation. To confirm his theory that I'm not your real choice. The elevator reached the ground floor doors opening to the busy lobby. Ethan placed his hand lightly on Samantha's back as they exited the gesture, appearing natural though it sent an unexpected warmth through her, despite its performative nature. We don't have to attend, he said as they walked toward the waiting car. The acquisition vote is scheduled. Thompson can't delay it further. Samantha considered the situation, weighing the professional stakes against the emotional complications of deepening their deception. No, we should go. If we decline, it validates his suspicions. Ethan studied her, perhaps reassessing her understanding of strategic social dynamics. Are you sure it would be intense scrutiny? I've handled parent-teacher conferences with families who believed their children were undiscovered geniuses, despite all evidence to the contrary, Samantha replied with a dry smile. I can manage dinner with a suspicious board member. As they settled into the back seat, Ethan turned to Samantha with an expression she couldn't quite interpret, something between appreciation and concern. Thompson is more dangerous than disgruntled parents. He has significant influence with the board and a vested interest in undermining my leadership. Samantha met his gaze steadily, understanding more than he realized about power dynamics and the politics of controlled environments. Then we'll need to be convincing. More than we have been. What do you suggest? Her response was direct, cutting through the careful distance they had maintained despite their public appearances together. We need to know each other, really know each other. The kinds of details that people in actual relationships share. Favorite books, childhood stories, how we take our coffee. The intimate knowledge that can't be faked. Ethan considered her proposal, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. Finally, he nodded once decision made. Tonight, after Oliver is asleep. We'll compare notes. The phrasing was clinical, typical of Ethan's approach to emotional matters, but Samantha recognized the significance of his agreement. They were about to move beyond performance into something more authentic, sharing personal histories not for genuine connection, but to create a more convincing illusion. The irony wasn't lost on her, using truth to construct a more effective lie. That evening, after Oliver had been tucked in with a story and the house had settled into nighttime quiet, Samantha found Ethan in his study. He looked up as she entered, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. She sat, noting that he had closed his laptop and set aside his phone's small signals that he was giving this conversation his full attention, a rarity in their interactions. So Ethan began, his tone deliberately casual, despite the unusual circumstances. What do you need to know? Samantha leaned forward slightly, aware that they were embarking on a strange intimacy, one constructed for a specific purpose, yet potentially meaningful nonetheless. Everything that matters, everything someone who loves you would know. The first light of dawn crept through the study window, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. Ethan leaned back in his chair, the conversation with Samantha having stretched through the night, hours dissolving as they excavated the details of their lives. What had begun as strategic preparation for Thompson's dinner had evolved into something neither had anticipated: genuine revelation of moments of unexpected laughter and the peculiar intimacy that comes from trusting another person with your story. I think we've covered enough, Ethan said, glancing at his watch with surprise. We should both get some sleep before tomorrow. Samantha nodded, the exhaustion evident in her eyes, despite the animation that had carried her through tales of her childhood in Vermont, her brother's early diagnosis, the teaching position she'd lost to budget cuts. She gathered her notes, casual observations about Ethan she jotted down to remember: black coffee with a single ice cube to cool it faster, childhood summers sailing on Lake Michigan with his grandfather, the Kurt Vonnegut novels, hidden behind finance textbooks on his office shelf. It's strange, isn't it? Knowing these things about each other now. It makes the pretending both easier and harder. Ethan studied her, understanding exactly what she meant, though he couldn't have articulated it himself. The knowledge they now shared created a foundation for their performance, yet simultaneously complicated the boundaries they had established. Thank you for doing this, he said, the formality of his gratitude at odds with the personal nature of their exchange. You've gone well beyond our arrangement. Samantha stood, tucking her notes into her pocket, her movements slow with fatigue. It's for Oliver too, not just for you or your company. He deserves stability. She left him sitting alone in the study, surrounded by the remnants of their conversation, a half-empty pot of tea, scattered pages of hastily written notes, the ghost of confidences, shared in the quiet hours when defenses naturally lower. Ethan remained motionless, processing the disorienting sensation of being truly known by someone for the first time since Catherine's death. The experience left him both exposed and paradoxically more secure, as if Samantha's understanding of him somehow validated his continued existence in a way that business success never could. The Thompson dinner loomed like a gathering storm, its implications extending beyond a simple social engagement to become a test of their fabricated relationship. The drive to Caroline's Westport home proceeded in thoughtful silence. Samantha dressed in an understated black dress that managed to be both elegant and appropriate. Her only jewelry, a simple pearl pendant that caught the light when she turned her head. Ethan found himself watching her more than was necessary, searching for signs of nervousness that might betray their deception. "Remember that Thompson will be looking for inconsistencies," Ethan murmured, as the car approached the sprawling colonial-style mansion set back from the road behind manicured hedges. "He'll ask questions designed to catch us in contradictions." Samantha met his gaze steadily, her composure apparent despite the pressure. "I'll be myself with the details we've shared. That's harder to dispute than a complete fiction." Her strategy was sound, grounding their performance in authentic elements while carefully navigating around the contractual nature of their arrangement. The car stopped at the circular driveway, a uniformed valet opening the door with practiced efficiency. Ethan placed his hand at the small of Samantha's back as they climbed the steps to the entrance, the gesture appearing natural despite its calculated nature. Caroline Thompson greeted them at the door, her polished appearance and practiced smile betraying her finishing school background. At 35, she possessed the confident poise of someone who had never questioned her place in the social hierarchy, her handshake firm, and her assessment of Samantha immediate and thorough. "How wonderful to finally meet you, Samantha. Walter has mentioned you several times since your appearance at the gala." The subtle emphasis on appearance wasn't lost on either Ethan or Samantha, the implication of transience and performance embedded in Caroline's seemingly welcoming words. Samantha responded with an easy smile that revealed nothing of her awareness of the subtext. "All good things, I hope. Though Walter seems like someone who notices everything, so I'm sure his observations were thorough." Caroline's eyebrows lifted slightly at the perceptiveness of the comment, her estimation of Samantha visibly shifting from dismissive to cautious. She guided them into a lavishly appointed living room where several board members and their spouses were already gathered, drinks in hand, conversation flowing with the practiced ease of people accustomed to such social obligations. Walter Thompson approached immediately, his attention focused on Samantha with laser intensity. "Miss Parker, I'm so pleased you could join us. Caroline has been looking forward to meeting Ethan's friend." Again, the hesitation before the word friend carried deliberate weight, a subtle questioning of the relationship's legitimacy. Samantha accepted a glass of white wine from a passing server, her posture relaxed despite the scrutiny. "I was grateful for the invitation. These events are always educational for someone like me." Walter tilted his head slightly, curiosity piqued by her phrasing. "Educational? In what way?" Samantha took a small sip of her wine, her response measured but genuine. "I spent years observing classroom dynamics, how people position themselves, form alliances, establish hierarchies. Corporate gatherings aren't so different, just with better wine and more expensive shoes." The unexpected comparison drew a surprised laugh from Walter, genuine amusement, breaking through his calculated facade. Ethan watched the interaction with carefully concealed admiration, impressed by Samantha's ability to be both authentic and strategic, using her outsider status as a strength rather than a liability. The evening progressed through drinks, dinner, and dessert, each phase presenting new challenges as board members and their spouses probed the nature of Ethan and Samantha's relationship. They answered questions about how they met truthfully when they realized their professional relationship had evolved, carefully constructed fiction, and their shared interests, a blend of real commonalities discovered during their late-night conversation and plausible fabrications. Throughout the evening, Carolyn positioned herself near Ethan whenever possible, her attention and interest evident in her body language and carefully directed conversation. During a moment when Samantha was engaged with another board member's wife, Caroline maneuvered Ethan toward a quiet corner of the dining room. "She's not what I expected, Ethan. Walter described her as your housekeeper." Ethan maintained his composed expression, though internally he noted the deliberate attempt to diminish Samantha's status. Samantha was Oliver's caregiver and household manager. She has a master's in education and considerable teaching experience. I don't define people by their current employment. Caroline nodded, a calculated smile playing at her lips. Of course not. It's just unusual in our circles. Though I suppose that's refreshing in its way. She placed her hand lightly on his arm, the gesture ostensibly casual but unmistakably intimate. I've always appreciated your independent thinking, Ethan. It's one of the qualities that would have made us a good match had circumstances been different. The directness of her statement confirmed what Ethan had suspected, that Thompson had prepared his niece for the possibility of an arranged relationship long before presenting the idea to Ethan. Before he could formulate a response that would neither encourage nor offend Samantha, appeared at his side, her arrival perfectly timed though. Nothing in her expression suggested she had been monitoring the situation. The Gardners were just telling me about their foundation's art education initiatives. I thought you might be interested, given your support of the museum's outreach program. The seamless rescue framed as a natural connection to their conversation earlier in the evening about arts patronage allowed Ethan to disengage from Caroline without awkwardness. As they moved toward the Gardners across the room, Ethan leaned slightly toward Samantha. Perfect timing. She glanced up at him, the ghost of a smile touching her lips. Elementary school teacher. I have eyes in the back of my head. The simple joke, delivered with quiet confidence, triggered an unexpected surge of genuine affection. In that moment, Ethan recognized that their performance had transcended mere acting to become something neither had anticipated: a partnership based on mutual understanding and unspoken communication, the kind that typically develops over months or years rather than the compressed timeline of their arrangement. The evening's most challenging moment came during dessert, when Walter deliberately steered the conversation toward family histories. After discussing his own genealogy at length, he turned his attention to Samantha. And what about your family background? Miss Parker, I understand you're from Vermont originally. The question seemed innocent enough, but Ethan recognized the strategic probe Thompson had clearly researched. Samantha's background, seeking to emphasize the class differences that separated her from their social circle. Samantha set down her dessert fork, meeting Thompson's gaze directly. 3 generations in Burlington. My grandfather worked for the railroad. My father taught high school physics. Simple people who believed education was the best inheritance they could provide. The dignity of her response silenced the table momentarily, her lack of apology for her middle-class background, commanding a respect that pretension never could. Thompson nodded slowly, reassessing his approach. And your mother? Samantha's expression softened slightly, the only indication that the question touched on sensitive territory. She was an artist. Not professionally, she managed an insurance office to pay the bills. But she painted whenever she could. I have one of her landscapes in my apartment. Nothing you'd find in a gallery, but it reminds me that beauty matters even when it's not profitable. The quiet authenticity of her answer resonated around the table, several guests nodding in unconscious appreciation of the sentiment. Ethan found himself wondering about this painting he had never seen, this piece of Samantha's history that existed beyond the boundaries of their contractual relationship. The realization that he wanted to know more, not for strategic purposes, but out of genuine interest, unsettled him in a way he couldn't immediately define. As the evening concluded and guests began to depart, Thompson approached them one final time, his assessment having evolved over the course of the dinner. I must say, Samantha, you've surprised me tonight. I can see why Ethan finds your perspective refreshing. The backhanded compliment hung in the air, its condescension barely veiled beneath superficial approval. Samantha accepted it with gracious neutrality, neither challenging the presumption nor appearing grateful for the validation. Thank you for including me, Walter. It's been an illuminating evening. In the car ride home, the tension they had both carried throughout the performance gradually dissipated, replaced by a shared sense of accomplishment and unexpectedly genuine connection. Samantha leaned her head against the seat, exhaustion finally claiming her now that the need for vigilance had passed. I think we passed the test, she murmured, eyes closed. Thompson wasn't convinced when we arrived, but by the end he seemed to accept the possibility that you might actually choose someone like me. Ethan watched her profile in the dim light filtering through the car windows, struck by the peculiar truth beneath their deception. In any other circumstance, without the artifice of their arrangement, would he have recognized the remarkable woman beside him, or would his habitual focus on status and appearance have blinded him to her intelligence, her integrity, her quiet strength. Someone like you would be a rational choice for anyone with sense. The words emerged before he could analyze their implications, their sincerity surprising even himself. Samantha opened her eyes, turning to study him with an expression he couldn't quite interpret, somewhere between surprise and caution, perhaps even a flicker of something warmer that disappeared too quickly to identify. That's kind of you to say, especially after watching Caroline make her interest so evident all evening. Ethan shook his head slightly, the image of Caroline's calculated attentions already fading from his mind. Caroline represents what Thompson wants for me, not what I want for myself. The admission hung between them, its implications extending beyond the immediate context to touch on questions of autonomy, authentic choice, and the constraints of expectation that had shaped Ethan's life long before Catherine's death. Samantha didn't respond immediately, her gaze turning to the passing street lights, each illuminating her face in brief flashes before returning her to shadow. "What do you want for yourself, Ethan?" The question was simple yet profound, cutting through the layers of performance and pretense to touch something essential. Ethan found himself without a prepared answer. The carefully constructed responses that typically served him in business, in social settings, suddenly inadequate for this most basic of human inquiries. "I don't know anymore. For a long time, it was just about maintaining what was left after Catherine died, preserving the company, providing stability for Oliver. Survival, not living." The unexpected honesty of his response surprised them both. Samantha turned back to him, her expression gentle but not pitying, a crucial distinction that allowed him to continue rather than retreat behind his usual defenses. "And now a fair question. The board meeting is Tuesday, the acquisition signing Wednesday. After that," he left the sentence unfinished, the future beyond their arrangement suddenly looming with uncomfortable emptiness. The car slowed as they approached Samantha's apartment building, the driver navigating through late-night traffic with practiced ease. Neither spoke as the vehicle came to a stop, the conclusion of their evening together carrying more weight than a simple social engagement should warrant. "Thank you for tonight," Ethan said, finally, the formality of the words at odds with the genuine appreciation behind them. "You were, remarkable." Samantha gathered her small evening bag, her movements deliberate, as if buying time to compose her response. "It's what you're paying me for." "Good night, Ethan." She exited the car before he could reply, the quiet finality of her statement creating a distance that hadn't existed during their shared performance. As the car pulled away, Ethan watched her enter the building, a curious emptiness expanding in his chest as she disappeared from view. The reminder of their contractual arrangement, the financial transaction at the heart of their relationship, had disrupted something fragile that had been building between them, returning them to their assigned roles after an evening of what had felt against all odds like authentic connection. The weekend passed with strange tension at the Reed household. Ethan found himself uncharacteristically present, adjusting his schedule to spend time with Oliver, whose delight at his father's attention was both heartwarming and quietly accusatory evidence of how rare such engagement had become in recent years. Samantha maintained her professional demeanor, the intimacy of the Thompson dinner, seemingly locked away behind her composed exterior. Only occasionally, when their eyes met unexpectedly or their hands brushed while passing a dish at Sunday dinner, did Ethan sense the undercurrent of something unresolved between them. Monday morning brought news that accelerated their carefully constructed timeline. Margaret appeared in Ethan's office doorway, her expression conveying the urgency of her message before she spoke. "Thompson has moved the leadership vote. It's now scheduled immediately before the Keller signing on Wednesday, not after as originally planned." The strategic manipulation was obvious, positioning the vote to create maximum pressure, leveraging the acquisition's importance to force Ethan's compliance with Thompson's vision for the company's leadership. Ethan maintained his composed exterior despite the internal alarm the news triggered. "He's pushing too hard. The board won't appreciate the tactics." Margaret's expression suggested she wasn't as confident in the board's resistance to Thompson's influence. "He's been meeting individually with members all weekend. Whatever he's telling them seems to be working." Ethan nodded, processing this new development with the strategic calculation that had served him throughout his business career. The timing change created a critical vulnerability. If the leadership vote went against him, the Keller acquisition would likely collapse, taking with it years of negotiation and strategic positioning. The company's market position, thousands of jobs, and his own professional legacy hung in the balance. I need to make some calls. As Margaret departed, Ethan reached for his phone, then hesitated, his thoughts turning unexpectedly to Samantha. Their arrangement had been constructed with a specific timeline in mind, a gradual building of credibility, culminating in her presence at the Keller signing, providing the image of stability that Thompson had insisted was necessary. The accelerated schedule disrupted that careful planning, forcing decisions that neither of them had anticipated making quite so soon. When he returned home that evening, Ethan found Samantha and Oliver in the kitchen, engaged in homework at the counter, the domestic scene Oliver's books spread across the surface. Samantha patiently explaining a math concept, the lingering aroma of dinner still in the air, struck him with unexpected force, a glimpse of what family could look like beyond the hollow performance he had maintained since Catherine's death. Oliver looked up, his face brightening at the sight of his father. "Dad, you're home early again. Miss Parker is helping me with fractions. They're tricky, but kind of fun once you get them." Ethan set down his briefcase, moving to join them at the counter, the day's tensions temporarily receding in the face of his son's enthusiasm. Fractions are just another way of looking at the same thing. Different perspective, same reality. Samantha glanced up at him, something in his phrasing catching her attention. Their eyes met briefly, an unspoken understanding passing between them, before she returned her focus to Oliver's worksheet. Exactly. And sometimes the new perspective helps you solve problems that seemed impossible before. After Oliver had gone upstairs to prepare for bed, Ethan approached Samantha in the kitchen, where she was finishing the dinner cleanup with her usual quiet efficiency. The parallels to their first conversation about the fake relationship arrangement weren't lost on him. The kitchen setting the evening light, the careful distance between them, as he prepared to once again alter the terms of their understanding. Thompson has moved the vote. It's now happening before the Keller signing, not after. Samantha paused in her work, recognizing immediately the implications of this change. When Wednesday morning, the signing is scheduled for that afternoon, she nodded slowly, processing the accelerated timeline and its impact on their arrangement. "So we need to be more convincing, more quickly than planned." Ethan hesitated, the solution he had been considering throughout the day suddenly difficult to articulate now that he faced her directly. "Thompson is campaigning actively with board members. The vote is likely to be closer than I initially anticipated. We need to present something more definitive than dating." Samantha set down the dish towel, her full attention now on Ethan, as she grasped the direction of his thinking. Define definitive. Ethan met her gaze directly, the business proposition he had rehearsed mentally throughout the day, now emerging as something more personal, more consequential than he had allowed himself to acknowledge. An engagement would secure the narrative. It would demonstrate commitment, stability, planning for the future. Everything Thompson has been questioning about my leadership. The proposal hung between them, its implications extending far beyond their original arrangement. Samantha remained still, her expression unreadable, as she considered what he was asking. An engagement. A fake engagement, to be clear. "Yes," Ethan confirmed, though something in her phrasing, the explicit labeling of the deception, unsettled him in a way he hadn't anticipated. It would be temporary, of course. We would announce it before the vote, maintain the appearance through the acquisition signing, then quietly end it after a suitable period. 3 months maximum. Samantha studied him, her analytical mind clearly processing the professional, practical, and personal dimensions of this expanded deception. "This goes well beyond our original agreement, Ethan. I understand that. I'm prepared to compensate you accordingly." The mention of money shifted something in Samantha's expression, a cooling that Ethan registered with unexpected dismay. She crossed her arms, creating a physical barrier between them that mirrored the emotional distance his words had inadvertently established. "What about Oliver? An engagement is a much bigger deception to maintain around him, and he's already attached to me. This would create expectations that would be cruel to break." The consideration for his son's emotional well-being, placing it above financial negotiation or professional strategy, struck Ethan with surprising force. Samantha's priorities remained consistent despite the shifting nature of their arrangement, her concern for Oliver a constant that Ethan found both reassuring and quietly challenging to his own compartmentalized approach. "We would explain it to him carefully. Make sure he understands it's temporary." Samantha shook her head, slightly unconvinced by his solution. "Children don't process temporary the way adults do, especially not children who have already experienced significant loss. To Oliver, this would look like a family forming then dissolving. Another abandonment, another confirmation that connections aren't permanent. The assessment cut through Ethan's strategic planning, forcing him to confront the emotional consequences of the arrangement that extended beyond business outcomes or financial compensation. He found himself unable to dismiss her concerns as if he might have done weeks earlier before he had witnessed firsthand her understanding of and connection with his son. What do you suggest? The question emerged with genuine openness rather than the perfunctory consultation he might have offered previously. Samantha seemed to register the shift, her posture softening slightly as she considered alternatives. We maintain the relationship narrative, but accelerate it. More public appearances together, more visible integration into your life. I attend the vote and the signing as your partner, but without an engagement that would create false expectations for Oliver. We emphasize commitment without formalizing it in ways that would be difficult to unwind. Her solution was pragmatic yet sensitive to the complex emotional terrain they were navigating. Ethan found himself nodding, impressed by her ability to balance the strategic necessities with the human considerations that he too often relegated to secondary importance. That could work. Thompson might still push for more formal commitment, but the increased visibility would address the immediate concerns about stability. Samantha studied him, her gaze penetrating in a way that suggested she was seeing beyond his stated reasoning to something he himself hadn't fully acknowledged. Is that what this is really about, Ethan Thompson's concerns? Or is something else driving this sudden acceleration? The question caught him off guard, its perceptiveness penetrating the careful distance he maintained, even from his own motivations. Ethan found himself considering the events of the past weeks, the gradual warming of his household, Oliver's increasing happiness, his own unexpected engagement with home and family after years of emotional absence. The possibility that these changes might be connected to Samantha's presence, rather than merely their strategic arrangement, was both unsettling and strangely compelling. I don't know, he admitted finally, the rare uncertainty in his voice revealing more than a lengthy explanation could have. Things are changing. The company, Oliver, this house, me. I'm trying to navigate it all while keeping what matters intact. Samantha's expression softened, something like understanding, replacing the wariness that had characterized her initial response to his proposal. I'll help you through the vote and the signing. We'll make it convincing enough to serve its purpose. But Ethan, when this is over, you need to figure out what you actually want, not just what Thompson or the board or even Oliver needs from you. The gentle challenge resonated in a way that more direct confrontation never could have, touching on questions that Ethan had carefully avoided since Catherine's death. What did he want beyond survival and maintenance of what remained? What future could he envision beyond the careful preservation of the past? Thank you, he said simply, the gratitude extending beyond her agreement to the insight she had offered without judgment or prescription. The morning of the vote dawned with unseasonable clarity, the October sky a perfect blue unmarred by clouds. Ethan adjusted his tie in the bedroom mirror, the familiar ritual suddenly charged with heightened significance. The day's outcomes would determine not just his professional future, but potentially the direction of his personal life, as well interconnected realities that he had kept carefully separated until Samantha's arrival had blurred the boundaries between them. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Oliver stood in the hallway, already dressed for school, but clearly wanting to speak with his father before departing. Dad, are you nervous about your meeting today? The perceptiveness of the question, recognizing the significance of the day despite Ethan's efforts to shield Oliver from business concerns, caught him by surprise. He knelt to his son's level, meeting the boy's solemn gaze directly. A little. Important decisions are happening today. Oliver nodded with the serious consideration that characterized his approach to life, so different from the carefree exuberance Ethan remembered from his own childhood. Miss Parker says sometimes being nervous just means you care a lot about something, and that's okay. The simple wisdom clearly absorbed from conversations with Samantha suggested a depth of emotional education that Ethan had neglected in his focus on providing material stability. He felt a surge of gratitude for Samantha's presence in their lives, her quiet influence extending beyond household management to shape Oliver's understanding of emotions and relationships in ways that would serve him long after their arrangement concluded. She's right. Caring deeply about outcomes means you're invested in something beyond yourself. Oliver nodded again, apparently satisfied with this confirmation of Samantha's insight. He hesitated, then asked the question that had clearly motivated his morning visit. Is Miss Parker going to your meeting too? The innocent inquiry carried layers of meaning that Oliver himself likely didn't fully comprehend. Questions about Samantha's role in their lives, her integration into Ethan's world, beyond the household, the nature of their connection, and its permanence. Ethan chose his response carefully, aware of the delicate balance between honesty and appropriate boundaries. Yes, she is. She's helping me with an important project. Oliver's face brightened, the answer clearly confirming something he had hoped to hear. Good. You're better when she's around, less sad in your eyes. The observation, delivered with the unfiltered honesty of childhood, struck Ethan with unexpected force. Had the change in him been so visible that even his 7-year-old son had noticed? The realization that Oliver had been monitoring his emotional state, cataloging the subtle shifts in his demeanor, suggested both a sensitivity and burden that no child should have to carry. Samantha was waiting in the kitchen when Ethan came downstairs, dressed in a tailored navy suit that projected professional competence while maintaining her natural elegance. She handed him a travel mug of coffee prepared exactly as he preferred, black, with a single ice cube to cool it to drinking temperature, immediately a detail she had learned during their night of exchanging personal histories. Oliver's already left with Mrs. Winters. He wanted me to wish you luck today. Ethan accepted the coffee, their fingers brushing briefly during the exchange, the small contact sending an unexpected current through him, despite its innocuous nature. He came to see me before leaving, said I was less sad in my eyes when you're around. Samantha's expression shifted, surprise giving way to something deeper, concern, mixed with a warmth that suggested Oliver's observation had touched her more than she had anticipated. Children notice everything, especially the things we think we're hiding successfully. The simple truth resonated beyond its immediate context, touching on the layers of performance and concealment that had characterized their relationship from its inception. As they prepared to enter the boardroom together, presenting a united front to Thompson and his allies, Ethan found himself wondering which parts of their connection were still performance and which had transcended the boundaries of their arrangement to become something authentic, something true despite its artificial origins. The boardroom hummed with tension as board members took their seats, the significance of the day's vote evident in the unusual silence that replaced the casual conversation that typically preceded meetings. Ethan and Samantha entered together, her presence beside him generating the subtle shift in attention that confirmed the effectiveness of their strategy. Board members who had known Ethan for years now viewed him through the lens of this new relationship, reassessing the solitary figure they had come to expect in light of the partnership he now presented. Thompson watched their entrance with calculated assessment, his gaze lingering on their body language, the unconscious synchronicity of their movements, suggesting a comfort level that would be difficult to fabricate. Ethan guided Samantha to a seat along the wall, present, but not at the table itself, a positioning that acknowledged her connection to him without overstepping into governance matters where she held no official role. The meeting began with standard procedures: approval of minutes, confirmation of agenda items, brief updates on ongoing initiatives. Throughout, Ethan maintained his usual composed leadership, though he found himself occasionally glancing towards Samantha, drawing unexpected reassurance from her presence despite the professional context. When Thompson finally introduced the leadership vote, his carefully worded motion emphasizing stability and family values in ways that directly referenced Ethan's personal life, the tension in the room heightened perceptibly. Board members spoke in turn, their comments revealing the divisions Thompson had cultivated and the considerations that would guide their votes. Gardner emphasized tradition. Mitchell focused on investor perceptions. Sanderson questioned the timing of the Keller acquisition. Throughout, Thompson guided the conversation with subtle direction, building a case for caution that implicitly challenged Ethan's leadership without directly attacking his competence. When the preliminary comments concluded, Thompson turned his attention directly to Samantha, his strategy shifting from institutional concerns to personal scrutiny. Ms. Parker, while you're not a board member, you've become a significant factor in our considerations regarding leadership stability. Would you care to address the board about your relationship with Mr. Reed and its implications for the company's future? The question constituted a direct challenge, placing Samantha in the uncomfortable position of either declining to speak, which would suggest uncertainty about their relationship, or addressing the board without preparation, risking statements that might later prove problematic. Ethan tensed, recognizing the trap Thompson had set, but before he could intervene, Samantha was already rising from her seat, her composure unshaken by the unexpected spotlight. Thank you, Mr. Thompson. I appreciate your recognition that personal connections influence professional contexts, though I'm sure the board's ultimate decision will rest on Mr. Reed's business acumen rather than his private life. The graceful acknowledgement of Thompson's tactic while simultaneously redirecting focus to professional considerations earned subtle nods from several board members. Samantha continued, her voice calm and measured. What I can tell you about Ethan Reed is this: he approaches his personal relationships with the same integrity and commitment he brings to this company. He considers the welfare of others before his own convenience. He values substance over appearance, which perhaps explains why our relationship didn't begin in the conventional circles Mr. Thompson might have preferred. Her directness drew a ripple of surprised reactions around the table. The gentle confrontation of Thompson's class-based assumptions unexpected in a setting where such biases typically remained unacknowledged. Samantha's gaze swept the table, making brief eye contact with each board member before continuing. The best predictor of how someone will lead is not who they choose to love, but how they choose to love with honesty, with courage, with consideration for the growth and autonomy of others. I've seen Ethan demonstrate these qualities consistently, both with his son and with me. I believe your company benefits from the same approach. She returned to her seat without further elaboration, the simplicity and brevity of her statement lending it a power that more elaborate testimony might have diminished. A momentary silence followed, board members processing both her words and the quiet dignity with which she had delivered them. Ethan found himself stunned by the elegant defense, its effectiveness heightened by the authentic conviction behind her carefully chosen words. What had begun as performance had somehow in that moment transcended pretense to become a truth neither of them had fully acknowledged until it was spoken aloud. Thompson recovered quickly, guiding the meeting toward the formal vote with practiced parliamentary procedure that masked his apparent reassessment of the situation. When the votes were tallied, 7 in support of Ethan's continued leadership, 3 against, the outcome represented a stronger endorsement than even the most optimistic projections had suggested. Thompson conceded with professional grace that didn't quite mask his disappointment, offering congratulations that carried the faint undercurrent of future challenges rather than genuine acceptance. As the meeting concluded and board members dispersed, Ethan found himself momentarily alone with Samantha in the emptying boardroom. The success of their strategy should have brought unalloyed satisfaction. Yet he found himself troubled by an unexpected realization. Their victory had emerged not from calculated performance, but from Samantha's genuine belief in qualities she perceived in him, a faith he wasn't entirely certain he deserved. "Thank you," he said simply, the words inadequate for the complexity of what had transpired. "What you said," Samantha met his gaze directly, something vulnerable yet steady in her expression. "I meant it, Ethan. All of it. That's what made it effective." The admission hung between them, altering the foundation of their arrangement in ways neither had anticipated. What had begun as a transaction, a strategic deception for mutual benefit, had evolved into something neither could easily define or dismiss. The realization that genuine feelings had developed within the framework of their fabricated relationship created a paradox that no business strategy or contractual clause could readily resolve. As they left the boardroom together, heading toward the waiting car that would take them to lunch before the afternoon's acquisition signing, Ethan found himself facing a truth he had been avoiding since their first successful public appearance together. The most convincing aspect of their performance was not what they had fabricated, but what had grown authentically despite the artificial context. The question that now loomed before him was whether that authentic connection could survive once the performance ended, and whether he was prepared to discover the answer.